Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to Batchelor Society on the 23rd of June, which is intending to discuss the relevance of historical statues, especially in the light of recent Black Lives Matter protests and movements to both remove statues and keep statues up. The format is a roundtable discussion. In the studio are Mr. Davies. We've also got Abby, Essen, Gazana, Luca, another Abby, and Khan, who are going to be letting us know their viewpoints on the current situation concerning statues. So I'm going to ask our first student, who is Luca, whether you would mind, please, Luca, outlining your views on the situation concerning statues.
Okay, so in my opinion, statues are not a way to record history, but to celebrate vulnerable aspects of it. Therefore, I think that individual statues should only be allowed to stay standing if their achievements outweigh their flaws. I personally believe it is actually okay to judge their achievements by modern standards, because I think that if we're to continue to glorify their achievements in the modern day, they have to adhere to our modern standards. However, I do think their statues should be their statues should be taken down just because of their outdated views, if they have achieved greater things separated from those views. I also think it is important to give context to historical figures whose statues remain standing. For example, I believe that statues of Churchill should remain standing, but awareness should be raised of his outdated views and destructive actions to give a rounded view of him, rather than airbrushing out his flaws. I also want to reiterate that I think that the notion of removing statues erases history is false, because history is recorded in records, textbooks, and museums, whereas statues inherently glorify what they represent.
Thanks, Luca. That's great stuff. I'm now going to ask Abby whether she could let us know her standpoint.
I believe that none of the statues should be taken down for many reasons. One of them is that I do not think it does anything for the Black Lives Matter movement. It does not change any legislation or any attitudes to racism, and it could be argued that it hurts the Black Lives movement more through destruction of shops and things that have been happening in America. Secondly, even if the statue of the person was a slave owner or someone who was racist, such as Edward Colston, for me, as it was the status quo at the time, especially for Edward Colston, who was alive in the 17th century during British imperialism, this was so normalized that now it can serve as a reminder to not return back to this. Because if we do not have a healthy respect for our past and our past history, it can repeat in the future, which we do not want. As Martin Luther King Jr. says, hate cannot drive out hate. And in my opinion, the hate of the protesters will not drive out the racist hate. So we should not take the statues down. Another reason that for this is that if you destroy the statues, you're destroying British history, the good and the bad side. Because although things seem barbaric now, such as slavery, and would never be justified today, this history shaped the future and the freedom which we are lucky enough to have now. So we shouldn't destroy it, because we need to, so that we prevent it from happening again in the future. Also, without debating the removal of these statues in Parliament, it's destruction of public property, which is illegal, and it's lawlessness and is mob rule, which sets a very dangerous precedent. So I believe that they should not be taken down.
Thanks, Abby. We're going to move to the third statement concerning statues, which is coming from Essen now, please.
Okay. So upon the whole debate with statues, I fundamentally believe you have a statue to celebrate, not as a reminder to history. And if you are making the argument that a statue must remain for history, it's mildly flawed, because when you go, for example, to a town square or to a street with a statue, you don't look at that statue as a symbolic piece of history rather than a celebration of the individual that statue represents. So in my opinion, the statues of people like Colston should be taken down, because they don't actually represent a tangible part of history worth celebrating. In fact, they actually represent, as mentioned, sort of a man who's a slave owner and one with considerably racist values. So by no means should statues be destroyed, but statues shouldn't necessarily be put up there unless they deserve to be recognized for an achievement. Now, in terms of the Winston Churchill statue, I believe that should remain because, as Lucas said, I think the whole idea, if the pros outweigh the cons, or in terms of actual successes outweigh the negatives, that warrants a statue. However, to stick up a statue of someone who arguably didn't really add that much to British society and then say taking it down is going against our history is, in my opinion, a flawed point, because I don't believe it will necessarily erase history, but highlight the fact that that which we deem to not be acceptable shouldn't necessarily be celebrated as a statue.
Thank you. And we're now going to move to Gazana to hear her viewpoint on the statues.
So I think I quite similarly align with Essen and Luca's views on it, that I think statues of, if we're going to use a popular example of Churchill, I think he is deserving of a statue in London, the country which he did benefit during his time as Prime Minister during World War II. But I think also, if we're going to glorify a man like this by giving him a statue, he's also on our £5 notes, and I think it's imperative that people have the right to know all the facts about him, because he wasn't an immaculate person who made no mistakes. He did make mistakes, and I think it's important that if we're going to make him into a big wartime hero, then people know both sides of the story. And I think statues aren't for educational purposes, in my opinion. For example, Germany had lots of statues of Hitler, roads named after him during the early 1900s. After World War II, all these statues of Hitler were removed, all the roads were renamed, and we still know about him through education. So in my opinion, statues aren't there as education, statues are there as reminders, but also learning experiences, if that kind of makes sense. And I think we should uphold these statues to our 21st century standards. So that's why I believe that statues such as Colston should be removed, because we can't compare them to how it was in the day. Back then in the day, slavery was more acceptable, because we are now living in 2020 where it's completely unacceptable.
Thank you very much. Could I now ask Khan for his views on the statue debate?
I believe that the statue debate can be broken down into 3 areas: whether there should be statues to begin with, how we should judge the people that the statues are made of, and how far this debate extends outside of just statues. To begin with, I would like to say I personally believe that statues should be there. They commemorate those who've done great deeds and have really helped society in different and varied ways. The presents, I believe, would be missed, and if they're removed in their entirety, you're left with empty space, and you have to ask yourself, what should you fill that space with? In terms of judging the people that the statues are made of, you'll almost always find a debate between the present and the past and the different moral standards that people were held to. You might even find that statues that are brought up now might be debated in the future, because those in the future have a different set of morals to the one we do. For example, the Winston Churchill statue. His statue was put up because he did something beneficial for the country. He won a war against Germany and arguably defeated a force that would be even more oppressive and racist than the comments that he personally made. In which case, I feel the statue is not to commemorate him as a person, but the actions he took in order to stop the advancement of the Nazis. It seems to me that while people have a right to debate whether the character of someone should be upheld, it is often the case that the character is not why the statue is put up. It is the action. It would seem, though, that if the character and the moral background of the person was taken into account, you might have fewer of these kinds of debates, but unfortunately that's not the type of world that we live in. Then I'd like to address how far this extends. Obviously, statues are a very visible representation of the people that they are, because it is literally a copy of that person. And ultimately, the critics of a certain individual will long outlive that individual by the fact that history books, you have a chance to study in depth and often uncover stuff that the public was not aware of during that character's life. I believe, however, that the debate must be extended to other items such as trusts and companies and buildings. But I also feel that while it is not appropriate to remove all statues, it must be judged by the local region, depending on what they have done for that region. It would seem to me that while renaming things like streets would be easy, removing trusts that have built up themselves on name recognition. For example, the Roundtree Trust that does an annual study on poverty will be difficult to remove, especially since that's how it's recognized. And it's an ode to the person who did that one study, not his entire life. I feel that the statues would be missed, and that while I'm not objecting to new statues put up of morally sound characters, you must argue whether the statues are there because of the action taken or the moral background of the character.
Thanks very much, Khan. Just to conclude this section from student perspective, could I ask Abby to let us know her views, please?
So personally, I agree with Khan. I think that statues should remain in place in society. And I think that the main purpose of a statue is to educate people about history and the events that have occurred in the past. And I think although often with statues there might not be a lot of information on the statue itself, I think it can spark debate and spark interest when an individual sees a statue, especially with children in society. When they see the statues, they might be encouraged to go and learn more about that historical figure or event. And in terms of the celebration of individuals, I personally think that every historical figure has their positive and negative attributes to them. So, for example, with Gandhi, he played such a vital role in generating Indian independence, but he also believed that the Indian race was superior to that of the Africans, and I don't think that we should negate the positive effect that he had on Indian society just by his negative attributes, because that's the same for every individual. And personally, I think we should judge historical figures by the values that were held in society at that time, because essentially they played a role in society in that period, and we shouldn't be judging them by higher moral values, given that was what society was like, and that society was different during that period and they had different beliefs. But I think at the same time we should look at the values and the differences in values and appreciate the steps that we've made to improve society, and use so for example, with some of the debates about the racism of Winston Churchill, we should instead think about the positives that we've made to come to the point where we think that those are wrong, whereas previously in society they'd been more accepted.
Thank you very much. We move on to hear now the view of staff on the statues debate. So I'm going to ask Mr. Davies for his viewpoint, please.
So I'm going to somewhat sit myself on a bit of a fence here, but I'll try and explain why. So there's been the kind of argument that I've found resonated with me most kind of in the previous weeks. Has been one kind of going around in historical academia circles, which has started to be reported a little bit more widely now, about how this debate about statues has become a kind of oversimplified, almost Trojan horse, a kind of oversimplified binary debate. And I think what a lot of historians have come out recently and tried to emphasize is the difference between memory and history. So between societal kind of consciousness and societal memory, not individual memory, obviously, but societal memory and history, and trying to impart upon people that these are two different things. Now, in those two spheres, statues sit as part of national memory. Statues, in many ways, aren't really history. History is an academic pursuit which investigates and interrogates, which examines, draws different conclusions from, surveys evidence. Statues aren't that. Statues are embodiments of values. And the reason people erect statues is because they embody the values of that time. So, Colston embodied the values of his time. Take the statue erected, of Mandela in 2007 in London. He embodies values that we wanted to promote. And I think in terms of where that puts them as a kind of relevancy, I think it does open them up to being interrogated as part of that national consciousness and where these things sit in our national consciousness. Now, with the Black Lives Matter movement in recent weeks, part of me also sympathizes with this view that the statues have become a sideshow and are part of what, you know, to use a term I'm not sure I'm comfortable with, but embody a culture war, which is actually a convenient sideshow for those who potentially don't want to look at the broader problems. So the culture war is a more tolerable thing to be going through for, for people who may have to look at themselves than an actual interrogation of the past and values and things like that. So I think where I sit with this is I'm still cautious about pulling statues down. If you look at Russia at the moment, there's been a resurgence in putting up statues of Tsar Nicholas II after they were torn down in the 20th century. But I do think before you get to that point, I think, for example, especially with the Black Lives Matter movement, statues are just a symptom. They're not the cause. And to be distracted and get into too deep debates about individual statues is actually probably a convenient thing for those who don't want to address the root causes of racism in society.
Thank you very much. It's probably only fair that I now put across my own views on statues. The bottom line is I haven't quite worked out where I stand with regard to statues, because there are very persuasive arguments either way, and many of them, in fairness, have been mentioned by individuals during this discussion already. So, for instance, Gazana spoke about, how even though there are no statues of Hitler, we have a collective awareness of who he was, and you've got to remember it actually works the other way as well. I'm reasonably certain that not many people listening to this would have heard of a person called Franz von Waldeck, who led the siege of Münster in 1535, which, again, people may not even have heard of the siege of Münster, but there's a statue of Franz von Waldeck. So I'm not quite sure how that works. How, clearly the notion of statues as historical records is clearly rather simplistic. And I also think there's a danger of oversimplification, as Mr. Davies was saying, by making the statues the sort of key focus here. I think if we're ever in a situation where anybody is allowed to say we can't be a racist society because we have no statues of slaveholders, then I think we've probably missed the point, as Mr. Davies says, about the broader issues regarding racism. One very difficult point, of course, about all of this, and this is something which has also been referenced by Luca, by Essen, and so on, is that this kind of thing is very subjective. People talk about the Churchill statue, for instance. So essentially, it's a question of weighing up positives and negatives about the individual's life, and then deciding whether, in your view, that individual deserves a statue. And the problem with that is that absolutely everybody is going to have a slightly different view. Everybody's going to put slightly different weight on positive and negative things achieved by a person within their lifetime. So fundamentally, a societal view is going to be very difficult to arrive at if we're looking for consensus. The other point I would say that I agree with from Abby, though, is the manner in which the statues are torn down. I think probably there would be way fewer objections to the removal of statues by people like Edward Colston, for instance, if it had been achieved through a less spontaneous mechanism. Now, I'm not judging whether the spontaneous mechanism was right or wrong, but I am saying that the spontaneity that accompanied its removal was something which has worried a lot of people, and therefore it is escalated from what could be a sound and reasoned debate into quite a confrontational set of arguments. The final point I'd make is that there is a school of thought which suggests that statues can actually achieve, by virtue of commemorating or even celebrating rather negative things. And I mean, good sort of statue anecdotes are kind of hard to find, but this is all I've got really. In Moscow, I think it may have been St. Petersburg, there was a statue of Alexander III, who was the Tsar who preceded Nicholas II. It was Alexander III on a horse. Alexander III was a very big, physically imposing guy, and this statue was known locally as the hippopotamus, because the horse and the Tsar on top of the horse looked like this massive, scary, terrifying, imposing thing, and it was considered a really very oppressive and horrible statue. Then the Russian Revolution happened, and all of the statues of the Tsar and Mr. Davies alluded to, the replacement of these statues. Now, all the statues of the Tsars were removed with this one exception of the Alexander statue. And it was argued that it was such a horrible representation of such a horrible time that the Russian people needed to be reminded of it in order to provide support to the new regime. Now, I'm not saying that that is in itself an argument for keeping any statues. I think the answer probably is you look at each statue on an individual case-by-case basis. But I am saying that it's very difficult for one person to say this statue is, requires to be removed because of what it stands for, because you also have the argument that this statue requires to be kept because of it standing for the same thing. Hopefully, we've given the listeners something to think about at this point. But what I would like to do now is turn to the second part of the broadcast, which is where the people who we have in the studio can ask questions about what they about the issue of statues, and we can try to get some responses going and have a little bit of dialogue. So do any of our studio guests have a question that they would like to raise with regard to statues? Okay, so we've got two questions. Abby's hand went up slightly before Ghazana's, so we'll go for Abby first, then we'll go to Ghazana. So Abby, your question, please.
Would you not argue that destroying these statues, even if they stand for something horrific and that should never be repeated, would you not argue that this destroys freedom of speech?
I am always conscious when people throw the argument about free speech into the mix, because I think we all agree free speech is a wonderful thing, but free speech does come with constraints. There is no, I don't think any sane person would argue that you want complete, there is such a thing as complete freedom of speech. The fire in the theatre shout, that's classically thrown around. Now, does pulling a statue, or whether you argue that they should be destroyed or put in museums, does that destroy freedom of speech? I personally can see why that's a kind of a line people want to take, but I would argue I think there's probably a kind of easier way to look at it in terms of if you engage in a debate. I think pulling them down in a violent manner is certainly more problematic, I think, like you alluded to, Mr. Weston, but going through a process of evaluation is not the removal of freedom of speech. I think looking at them in terms of values is certainly encouraging freedom of speech, if anything.
Okay, can I ask Ghazana what your views are on that?
Mr. Davies kind of already mentioned it, but I think that the putting up of a statue to commemorate a past historical event, I wouldn't call that freedom of speech, because it's a coordinated, governmentally organised thing. It's not something like a band of people. I mean, it may have been organised by people having strong feelings about it, like maybe organising a petition because they feel strongly about this key historical figure or event. But in my opinion, I think, like Mr. Davies said, the removal of statues is more of a sign of freedom of speech than putting ones up are, because I think it shows that they have a problem with what's already there.
Essen's also indicated he'd like to respond to that point.
Yeah, okay, so what I wanted to sort of say was is that Abby sort of mentioned destroying the statues, and I think it's quite important to realise that not everyone's calling for these statues to be destroyed, but instead to no longer be put up in public prominent places, but instead to be moved to museums. So for example, is Coulston, who originally they threw it into the river, but it has recently since been pulled up and is going to be put in a museum. So I don't think that necessarily they should be destroyed by any means, but I think also the movement isn't to destroy the statues, but instead relocate them to a place of learning, i.e. a museum or something like that instead.
Okay, thank you. And the last one on this point, could I ask Luca?
I just have a very short response to Abby's point about it destroying, removing freedom of speech. I personally believe that freedom of speech comes down to an individual level. So I don't think it removes the ability of an individual to speak out against the removal of the statue or to speak up about any issue. I think if it's a collective kind of decision to remove the statue, I don't think it really affects freedom of speech on an individual level. And I think that freedom of speech is inherently individual. So.
Do you guys think that the media is covertly racist in its portrayal of the removal of statues?
I think that the real difficulty has been in the way that the statues were removed. I think that the fact that what we've seen is a lot of people doing things which we wouldn't expect to see on a regular basis, i.e. people clambering up on plinths and pulling down statues and all the rest of it, rather than, you know, more sort of, how do I put it, a regulated removal. I think that that's certainly not helped the issue. And I do think that it has, you know, showing a violent removal of statues has the potential to alienate some people, and some people are going to read racism into that somewhere along the lines. It's much more difficult for me to address the general question of whether I feel that the media is covert. What was the phrase again? So covertly
racist in its portrayal of the removal of statues.
It's possible that it might be unintentionally, I think, but it's certainly pretty negative in its in its stance about statue removal, and that's obviously because of the points which have been raised earlier about vandalism, destruction of private property, and so on. And obviously, the media is keen to sort of promote standards in that area, which you know, which we could all expect. You know, they don't want to encourage people to rip down private property or public property or whatever it happens to be. And I think that that's probably the main thing. And then I think added on to that, of course, is the fact that we are talking about, you know, a racist issue of slavery. And I think that that's allowed a lot more of a racist interpretation to be drawn. I wouldn't say that the mainstream media have set out to covertly promote something. And the other example I'd give to sort of back that up is that the publicity which surrounded the removal of various statues in London subsequent to the Colston incident has not provoked anything like the same amount of outrage and outcry. And I think one difference there is that instead of it being the public removing the statues, it was a local government decision to remove statues.
I would just, you've said many of the things I was going to say, but I would just broaden the line out slightly. And I think, again, to focus energies and say the kind of in a broad generalization that the media is covertly racist, I think is again oversimplifying what is a very nuanced issue. Nuanced is the right word, but a complex issue. And I would say that there are many aspects of the media, many parts of the media, which will at times exhibit what would to many people appear racist. But I think the point is, more broadly speaking, that the way our media works, the way much of especially print media needs to generate sales, online views, clicks, advertising, etc., leads to the media actually, yes, at times it will be, some parts of the media will be racist, but I think the media more generally punches, essentially. And I think, again, it's to denigrate how bad some of our media is to say they are solely a racist institution, because I would say there are many aspects of the media where you'll see where they will attack, they will punch, to use that phrase, different classes. And I would say there's a class issue in the media which is prevalent, race issue, nationalities, you know. And I think so I think the issue goes beyond racism again in that regard. And I would point to certain wings of the media that punch, and it doesn't matter whether that's punch towards a different race, towards a different class, they will punch, to say it for about the 15th time.
Do we as a society and an education syllabus need to emphasize both sides of the argument? For example, people like Winston Churchill that we idolize, do we need to have a better education system which highlights both the positives and the negatives that people like that had upon the society that we live in?
I think there's a difference. I think, again, to kind of goes to the media, there's a difference between being balanced and being impartial. I think in terms of giving people facts and things that are, you know, stated, you know, if we're going to use Churchill as an example, you know, Churchill said many things about people of different ethnic and national backgrounds, and I think it is right that you give stated facts. Now, I don't think that means, you know, you kind of, I always think back to the argument about, you know, flat earthers. Doesn't mean you have to, if something's factually incorrect, you don't give back both sides of the argument. But actually, I do think there is a duty of if we're looking at history as a kind of academic pursuit, the point of history is to examine arguments. It isn't to present eulogized views of individuals, or to, the role of history in a school isn't to promote national feelings of superiority. It is to be a interrogative discipline where you look at the evidence and you look at both sides. So I think history, if we take it as a discipline, that I think we all do here, yes, I think it's right that you do give both sides.
What do you think is the role of a statue in society? Do you think it's a part of education, or is it the celebration of the individual?
Well, Abby, in my opinion, a statue is very much dependent on where it's located. So if a statue, for example, in a main square, for example, out of Winston Churchill's, that is not just a statue, but a celebration of an individual. But a statue, for example, in a museum is that of education. And I think primarily why we make statues and place them in important areas and buildings is to celebrate the achievements of what that person had done. I think the role of a statue in society is actually very much dependent on where that statue is, because there's a fine line between having a statue in a square for celebration and that for learning. So in response, it is, in my opinion, up to where it's placed. And the view is if it's in a museum or a place of learning for education, and if it's in a more public area for as like a sightseeing or as a celebration.
The general point, do you believe that we have the right to judge statues that are located in other areas, by which people might have a different sense of the good that a character has done?
Can I just clarify, when you say other areas, are you talking geographically within the UK, or are you talking outside of the UK?
Both. You've got long distance statues, for example, Confederate statues in America, but then again, you also have more divisive statues, for example, Chamberlain up in Birmingham.
Yeah, well, you know what I'd say about a statue of Joseph Chamberlain. Curiously, I do think that other nations, possibly European nations more, have a bit of a different view on statues, and they don't seem to be terribly wedded to the idea that statues have to remain or have to fall. There was, for instance, until quite recently, a statue of Maximilien Robespierre, a French revolutionary leader, in his hometown of Arras, and they took it down because apparently he wasn't very popular. He led the Committee for Public Safety and organised the terror. But, I wonder if there's something here which is actually to do with a bigger thing of history. Obviously, the UK has, as in terms of its sort of city landscape, it's evolved in a haphazard way because it's never been levelled by bombs or, had to be reworked to prevent insurrection, which is, some of the key reasons that cities like Berlin, Paris, Amsterdam and so on look like they do. I think if you're more at ease with the idea that every so often you've got to change bits of your city for some reason, probably changing statues is easier. Okay, that draws to a conclusion our discussion today. I hope you found it enlightening and thought-provoking. We've endeavoured to get in as many sort of facts as we can, or questions as we can, but you'll appreciate that this is an incredibly topical and lengthy subject, and we're a little bit constricted in terms of how much time we have. Thank you very much for listening. Thank you to Mr. Davies, to Abby, Essen, Gazana, Luca, Abby and Khan, and enjoy the next couple of weeks. Thank you.